It's a story that begins at the end.
The DJ, television presenter and tireless fundraiser Sir Jimmy Savile has died. He was 84. He became a radio DJ and then a television presenter on Top of the Pops, and Jim will fix it.
Now today is part of a 3-day celebration of Sir Jimmy's life.
Sir Jimmy Savile was taken for one final tour of his home city today.
Broadcasting career, he devoted his energies to fundraising for charity, most notably for the Spinal Injuries Unit at Stoke Mandeville Hospital in Buckinghamshire.
He was a personality larger than life.
The trademark hairstyle and cigar.
His memory is honoured by the Lord Lieutenant of West Yorkshire, who today represents His Royal Highness, Prince Charles.
How on earth do you raise £10 million in 3 years?
The whole of the British establishment was succoured by Jimmy Savile.
I thought you were going to fix my getting into number 10.
I've already done so.
A story of the crimes and cover-ups behind the fake persona. The story of those who knew.
Everybody knew that Jimmy Savile was a pervert. They knew. There's no way they couldn't know. If I knew, they knew.
In my view, certainly in the 70s and 80s, everyone in senior management at that period would have known about Savile.
I did blow the whistle on Jimmy Savile many years ago. I received the message to keep my mouth shut.
The fundraising had a lot to do with why people didn't speak up. It was raising a lot of money.
And the story of those who could not tell.
I decided that if I told anyone, they wouldn't believe me.
As the nation mourned Jimmy Savile, a BBC Newsnight producer suspected there was a story that had been hidden for years.
From about 1960, my aunt ran Duncroft School. It was her little empire, really, and she was trying to do her best for the kids.
Duncroft is an approved school for girls for which the National Association for Mental Health acts as a trustee for the Home Office. The name is taken from the...
Duncroft School was a very weird institution. It was like something out of fiction. It had wonderful grounds, but it had bars on the upper windows.
It is a pioneer school, the first in Britain to provide regular psychiatric treatment for the girls sent to it from the courts. Girls usually...
And it was really a cross between a prison and a finishing school. My aunt raised money by having summer garden parties, which were always full of celebrities. She would get the support of minor royals, ex-film stars, and people from the music world. So in that context, it wasn't that weird seeing Jimmy Savile there at those garden parties. But what was weird was he kept turning up the rest of the time. And you'd come up the gravel drive, and very often you would see Jimmy Savile's convertible Rolls Royce there, and you would know he was there.
I was sent there, I was 14. He'd come along to visit. He would bring great boxes of gifts. He'd bring boxes of the latest top 10 records and cigarettes, makeup, perfume, all the things that teenage girls would like. And then he would offer you more cigarettes or more money or more records or whatever for little favours. And that's when he'd get an attack of wandering hands or worse.
In 1990, Lynn Barber, who was at the time the most respected interviewer on Fleet Street, ran an interview with Savile. She said, "Every Fleet Street editor that I know thinks he's a paedophile." And that made me start reassessing what I'd seen at Duncroft. And then in the early 2000s, social media networks started to spring up. And again, there were hints there in terms of Duncroft that something had happened. And it wasn't until I read Karen Ward's self-penned autobiography on the web in early 2011 that I started putting things together.
I'd been seeing a clinical psychologist, and she said to me, "Do you know what? You should write a book. You should write it down." And I can remember saying to her, "Oh yeah, right. Who's going to want to read that?" And she and the psychiatric nurse straight away said, "Well, I would."
Her description of Duncroft was absolutely exact in how I remembered it. And then she talked about JS, taking them out. Well, I knew who JS was.
Once he realised what sort of establishment Duncroft was, I think he was just like a kid in a candy store. He went through girl after girl after girl. These girls were vulnerable, these girls were damaged.
The next thing I knew, he'd dropped dead. And at that point we thought, well, if we think this stuff is true, let's go and interview her. I contacted Karen Ward. We did the interview, we came out of it, we were convinced by what she had to say. It was honest evidence.
Now then.
Our researcher found clips from Clunk Click, which was the predecessor to Jim Will Fix It that the girls from Duncroft had gone to, and we could recognise them sitting with Jimmy Savile and Gary Glitter.
Just put yourself in there.
Oh, lovely.
I get two. You get two. In there.
Oh. He'd got his programme, Clunk Click. It was wonderful, it was great.
I should be giving girls away, lessons there, but I'm going to get some down here then.
You had your stage audience, where we sat, and we had great big bean bags.
See you next week for another Clunk Click. Ho-hoy!
I ended up filleting him because he promised me that if I did, I could go to London and be on the stage on his television show. At the time, I didn't see that as any kind of abuse. As far as I was concerned, it was reasonable payment for what he was offering, because my mindset was that of a damaged individual.
And then as we walked out of her house, she said, "The BBC will never let you show this." And I said, "The BBC aren't like that anymore. Maybe they used to be, but they're not like that anymore." We were told, get ready for transmission. We had a day in early December to broadcast. We had what we needed. We were also realising that we were hearing stuff about Stoke Mandeville Hospital, Hotel Garenne, the Channel Islands. There were probably 100 victims. It was a systemic thing now, not just one place. This is going on everywhere that Savile operates. But then we heard that the BBC were going to make Christmas a celebration of Jimmy Savile. And we all nervously laughed and said, well, that's not going to happen, because obviously they couldn't run our expose and the tributes. The crunch date is the official day when the BBC announces its exact Christmas schedules. And on that day where they announce what time, which programmes all the Savile tributes are going out on, we are told that our story is blocked. Even as a dead man, his power and his presence was such that the BBC would deploy everything it had in its power to try and stop the truth coming out.
The fulsome tributes went ahead, celebrating Jimmy Savile's near 50 years with the BBC.
This is the story of Jimmy's remarkable life, as it happened. Now then, now then.
Born in Leeds, the year the city celebrated its 300th birthday, Jimmy Savile was the youngest of 7. His father, a bookmaker's runner. He became a Bevin boy, working in the mines with other boys to help the war effort. It was here that Jimmy Savile discovered what he called the power of odd, completing a shift wearing a suit and tie, which got him noticed and talked about. As the decade began, Jimmy Savile was an actor in A Boy, a Girl and a Bike, briefly glimpsed pedaling furiously.
Well, that was an attack. That was a
Later, a professional wrestler, the showman loved by fans.
He's there. Oh, look at that. What's that? Hooray! Jimmy Savile has got him. An absolutely splendid performance by Jimmy Savile. Marvellous. May I say how fit you are looking, Mr. Savile?
Which part of me?
He then is very quickly into the new craze for dance halls, the new teenagers with money to spend, going out on a Friday or Saturday night, and he becomes a very big character in all that. He becomes one of the first DJs.
All right, man, get jumping. Mix those muscles and chuck your chick.
When rock and roll started to come in, suddenly there was youth culture, and there'd never been youth culture before.
Pete Waterman was a disc jockey working for Jimmy Savile.
Jimmy Savile was actually the assistant manager of the ballroom. He was a gimmick man. He was the best self-promotion I ever saw. I mean, he promoted himself and the nights brilliantly. I remember he had his hair dyed tartan and things like that. I mean, he was a showman. That's what he was. He, you know, people came because they wanted to see Jimmy Savile. His Wednesday nights in Manchester were packed. Packed. You couldn't get near the place.
But there were already signs of a darker side to Savile. At the Manchester Plaza, he employed fellow wrestlers as bouncers, under orders to tie troublemakers to chairs in the basement until they begged for mercy. And aged 28, the first recorded complaint of sexual abuse was made against him, but dismissed.
I know that Mecca, who owned a lot of these halls, warned their senior executives not to let their young daughters anywhere near Savile, even though they carried on employing him and paying him loads of money because he would draw in the crowds. There are various stages where he comes to the notice of authorities. According to people who knew him, he was buying his way out of trouble with the police.
When I was a very young reporter in the Midlands, the local Mecca ballroom manager told me that it was an open secret in Manchester in particular, and I think also to a lesser extent in Yorkshire, that Jimmy Savile had a predilection for young girls, underage girls. He'd been stopped by police with a underage girl in his car, but that because of his connections to the police, he was able to get the thing brushed into the carpet. It was never pursued. He had cultivated police officers locally and also helped raise money for police charities, and this was his, in a way, his modus operandi to keep himself protected.
January 1961. The successful Northern DJ makes national headlines when he's flown to Hollywood to present Elvis Presley with a gold disc for record sales. Savile was becoming so famous, he was cast as himself in the low-budget film Just for Fun.
Good evening to you, ladies and gentlemen. And how are you all? We hope you're going to have a wonderful evening this evening. We have some wonderful entertainment lined up for you.
And in Ferry Cross the Mersey, as Jimmy Savile, eccentric talent show host.
Very, very good. A big welcome for the one and only, the Black Wave.
And then, of course, when the Beatles broke, he spotted this wave, and boy, did he ride that wave.
Disc jockey Jimmy Savile and the impresario of the Beatles, Brian Epstein, now watch the professional ballroom dancing award winners, Bill and Bobby Irving.
He was all over it like butterscotch. He leapt on that whole bandwagon with the Beatles, and he was everywhere. He was everywhere. I mean, he was just everywhere. He was already a big household DJ on Radio Luxembourg.
What a lunatic you are, Perth, driving like that.
I first heard of him listening to Radio Luxembourg.
Ladies and gentlemen, here we are, Percy and Jimmy Savile, the Savile twins, tonight to bring to your delight.
Radio Luxembourg was a station beamed out of the Duchy of Luxembourg to a British audience playing pop music. And in these days, the BBC didn't play pop music. So we listened to Luxembourg to get our kind of music, and Jimmy Savile was one of the DJs who had a show on that. It was called the Teen and 20 Club.
So let's go inside and swap with them. It's a bit cold in here, personally.
He seemed strange even then, but he used that as a springboard and became one of the most famous people in the country.
Aged 37, Savile's crimes and those who knew about them were to escalate dramatically. He's chosen to launch a huge new BBC show.
Welcome to January the 1st, 1964. It's 6:34 p.m. and it's a programme that you've never heard of before. It's called Top of the Pops.
Top of the Pops created huge stars out of people like Jimmy Savile.
Equipping the oil boom has brought this kind of new technology to Scotland.
I used to do a show for the BBC called Tomorrow's World. It came out on the same night as Top of the Pops. And there were all these young girls waiting for the rock bands to arrive to do their live performances, but they were also waiting for the DJs. And they screamed and threw themselves on the DJs just as much as they did onto the rock stars. But we never suspected that he was actually molesting young children, assaulting young children, raping, abusing young children. That was not on our radar.
Rumours about Savile had been received by tabloid newspapers. By 1965, it's now believed he was responsible for 30 rapes and other sexual offences.
There's a People journalist who tries to expose him in the mid-60s and is stopped by their editor because Savile is a valued columnist and the People's way of accessing young people and getting them to read their paper. So there's a whole trail of stuff.
Leeds General Infirmary, 760 beds, and is presently being rebuilt and extended.
By this time, Savile calculated that charity would give him respectability, publicity, and access to vulnerable people. He offered his services to Leeds General Infirmary and was accepted.
My name's David Brett and I was a management services officer at Leeds General Infirmary when Jimmy Savile was a visitor there. Jimmy Savile came into the refectory and there was all this whoosh of, this sharp intake of breath. This god had walked in. He'd be looking around, smiling at everyone. No one ever directly discussed Savile's sexual tendencies, but they used to allude to certain things, and say, he's looking at that girl in such a way. There'd be some nursing students, probably 17, 18 years old, and then people would say, Jimmy's looking at her, and they'd say, well, no, he needs 10 years knocking off for him to be interested. So it was quite obvious that he was into very young girls. I heard many times Jimmy Savile referred to it as a non-Tory kiddie fiddler. It was always something derogatory.
Here we go with what's called a medical breakthrough.
The fundraising had a lot to do with why people didn't speak up. He was raising a lot of money. He was a very big name. And to lose him would have meant losing money for the various charities that he was supporting. So had somebody blown the whistle on him then other people would have suffered.
Savile had his own office and free 24-hour access to all areas.
I think the hospital administration was well aware of what was going on, but just kept quiet.
He abused 60 staff and patients, 19 of them children.
I think some people, they may have gone to their supervisor or someone, but nobody would have listened. They would have brushed it under the carpet because people just didn't talk in those days. It's not like it is now.
Those who complained were not believed. Meanwhile, Savile raised £3.5 million for Leeds General Infirmary.
Nobody ever questioned why he was dressed or acting the way that he did, because they just wanted him there to raise money. And he raised a lot of money.
Jersey, the miles of spacious beaches. Such charm is undeniable.
I was, as any 14-year-old in the 70s was, just really sort of innocent and hopes and dreams of a 14-year-old, like going on to uni, being a teacher, getting married, having 2 kids, all that stuff, yeah. I was a really good student, and that is why I got taken away on a special holiday, because I'd done so well. My mum said I could go anywhere, so I knew she'd really like to go to Jersey.
There's disc jockey Jimmy Savile getting close, very close to Gaynor Lacey, the reigning Jersey holiday queen. Watch it, you might get a figure like this.
We got to the hotel and we went into the dining room that evening, and there was this other girl there about my age with her mum and dad, and so we'd sort of said hello. That was quite nice. There was some of my age. And then during dinner, Savile walked in. My mum sort of slightly went to pieces. She was like, oh, wow. He came up to us straight away. I was definitely targeted, and he sort of spoke to me a bit, but was really complimenting me via my mum and really flirting with my mum.
Jersey, in spirit, half French, half English.
The next day, the girl from the other family, she and I sort of met up. Because it was a posh hotel, you couldn't go out the front door in your beachwear. So you had to go out the back door, which we did. And that's where Savile's motorhome was. So he wasn't staying in the hotel. He was staying in his motorhome. He came up to us and asked if he could take some photos. I had the camera. So he only took photos of me, got this other girl to take photos of him and I. He'd pulled me closer and he had his knee thrust between my legs. Then he said, did we want to look round his van? And she went in, I went in, and he came in behind us and just slammed the door. He just totally changed. He was really aggressive. Straight away, he told this girl to sit down, and he pulled me in front of him, stood up in front of him, and then stuck his hand up my skirt and pulled my pants down. Basically, he was masturbating while he was doing this. And I didn't know people did that, so my absolute innocence or ignorance was that I didn't know people did that. And shoved himself into my mouth, and that just went on and on. I don't know how long it went on, but I remember and I was crying and I was trying not to be sick, and I couldn't breathe and I couldn't breathe, and I just didn't think I was going to get out of there. And then after that, he literally just pushed me aside, and he was just so angry. He was just so livid. But there'd just be this bout of like really weird laughter, which made it seem even more insane. There was definitely threats not to tell anyone that we'd been in the van. I didn't tell my mum, and yeah, I really blame my mum for not knowing.
Now Jim's back again, this time with Mary Horton, Miss Battle of Flowers.
And we had the whole week after that. We were going to see the Battle of the Flowers, and Savile was leading the parade.
and Jimmy Savile's still not far away.
And my mum was just pushing me and saying, "Why aren't you waving?" And she was just so annoyed. And I was so sullen and just so full of hate. You know, I didn't want to go out anymore. I didn't want the holiday. I didn't want to eat. I didn't want to go in the restaurant anymore. I didn't want to see him anymore. And I don't know how you, as a child, how you would ever begin to tell your mum something like that had happened when you don't even know like that something like that exists. So yeah, it sort of broke us. I was a really nice kid, a really good student, head girl. And I just wasn't a little girl anymore, not after that. His ability to make me feel that I had done something so wrong. Because why was he so angry? Why was he so happy outside the van? Why was he so angry? Why did he push me out? You know, none of it. There was no making sense. So you can never sort of think you're going to tell someone that, because they're like, it doesn't make sense. If you found the courage to say it, the odds of being believed are like none, so you're just not going to say it.
The same year, 1972, Savile drove his motorhome to Buckingham Palace.
Jimmy Savile received the OBE. Jimmy, of course, is the well-known disc jockey, but what's not generally known is he does a very considerable amount of work to help hospitals and charities. But then, that's his serious side.
Savile's OBE proved he'd been right, enhancing his status as a TV personality and giving his questionable on-screen behaviour respectability.
You don't have a lead with that colour, do you?
Sometimes.
Do you? That's good. Is that husband behind? Sort of. Oh, ladies and gentlemen, I'll tell you what we'll have now. At number 19, ladies and gentlemen, part of the Union from the Straws.
He was one of television's biggest stars, watched by 20 million viewers a week. But hidden from sight, Savile was out of control, committing at least 19 rapes and assaults at Top of the Pops.
My name's Nicola, and I worked at the BBC from the age of 17. I joined the costume department, so I would work on Top of the Pops. Jimmy Savile was about the biggest celebrity that there was there at the time. You realise what a powerful figure he was, really, for a DJ, for just an ordinary DJ at the BBC. They would treat him like he was royalty. You would see him come into the main reception at the television centre. He literally had an entourage with him, and the producer and the other people, they were in deference to him. He was in control. If he needed a jacket or some costume thing for Top of the Pops, he would always have a particular group of dressers that would work with him. The young women never went near him. We were told not to, and we didn't, and we didn't want to. And the makeup girls, they couldn't stand him either. There's a cage area where they would keep the props, and Jimmy Savile would often go in there, and he would be sitting with the props guys, who were mostly older men, and it was a seedy bunch. They said to me one day that he would go in there to ask for them to pick out the youngest and prettiest girls to send to his dressing room after.
Now then, Mr. Powell will tell you of the musical content whilst I attend to legs and counts.
He did have a type, because he would take the younger girls. He would take the girls who were still being dressed by their parents in sort of school sandals and ankle socks. He liked the young people that were as close as possible to children's age. We're hearing the reports now of him putting his hand up girls' skirts and forcing his tongue down their throats. I didn't imagine that kind of thing, but I imagined something unpleasant was going on in there, that they, you know, would have to do something nasty with him.
I'll tell you something. The fella could get used to all this. As it happened to you, they could get used to it. So
Everybody knew that Jimmy Savile was a pervert. Everybody knew that's what he was, and that's what he was doing at the BBC.
A BBC inquiry years later reported that at the time, the young woman holding the flowers complained to a BBC employee that Savile had put his hand under her bottom. She was told not to worry. It's just Jimmy Savile mucking about. A senior staff member told the inquiry that they didn't realise anything improper was happening.
Everybody knew, and I would think that the older men, they all knew. They knew. They knew, because they would go into his dressing room with him after. You know, they knew. There's no way they couldn't know. If I knew, they knew.
The inquiry cleared management, but criticised the BBC's culture of not complaining. Staff didn't speak up for fear of losing their jobs.
Maybe someone complained, but I would never have thought to complain. With what I saw, it was just what happened. To have a job at the BBC was a good thing, you know, it was a good place to work, the pay was good, you were kind of there for life if you wanted to be, if you behaved. So yeah, you wouldn't put that at risk by raising something that was obviously so massive.
In the early 70s, there are a series of scandals around Top of the Pops.
Aged 15, this girl committed suicide after being raped by a singer on Top of the Pops. When her mother complained, the BBC replied there was no evidence the rape happened. The girl was also pictured dancing with Jimmy Savile.
There is a very desultory inquiry by the BBC, and really nothing happens as a result of that. Savile and the rest continue there. There are slight tightenings up of who's allowed to be in the audience and so on, but very little is done.
Good evening. Welcome. Another edition of Top of the Pops. Lots of nice young ladies about with us this evening.
Two radio controllers were aware of what was going on. He was even brought in to be questioned about having young girls at his flat overnight. He made some excuses. They were accepted. And it was, well, you know, what can you do about Jimmy? There was never really any question of doing anything about him. It was just a shot across the bows, hoping maybe that he would stop doing it, or at least that he wouldn't be caught, because a major part of the BBC's concerns at that time was whether the press were going to run with the story. And because of his charity work and everything else, people in the press who the BBC went to and said, are you going to run it? Said, no, we're not going to. He had protection. In my view, certainly in the 70s and 80s, everyone in senior management at that period would have known about Savile. He was an incredibly valuable asset, and they did not want to take a risk of losing a star.
I moved to Leeds in 1974 to become a reporter on Look North, which is the old BBC regional television station. We often found that we had Savile on our show whether we liked it or not, but we were quite often told by those on high at the BBC in London that he was a very important person, that he was one of their big stars of one of their biggest light entertainment shows, and we had to do what we were told. We heard a lot of stories about Jimmy's Friday morning club, which seemed quite an interesting gathering that Jimmy had put together over the years, from his school friends through to prominent local businessmen and local doctors, and certainly quite a number of policemen were encouraged to go round to his flat overlooking Roundhay Park on a Friday morning, where they drank industrial-strength tea out of large mugs and ate very, very cheap, nasty cakes. whilst apparently kicking around the latest news and current affairs and community relations in Leeds. It was all part of Jimmy's huge sphere of influence, that he had cronies and chummies in all the right places, and we were pretty sure that he may well have asked a few favours of some of those people who went to his Friday morning club. Jimmy Savile's relationship with the police was pretty curious, and it seemed to go on for an awful long time, and if the police ever suspected something about some of the abuse and activities he got up to, they certainly either covered it up or they were blissfully unaware of it. Either way, they seemed to give him an ideal cloak of protection almost throughout his life.
My name's Guy Marsden, and I am Jimmy Savile's nephew. When I was 15, at that time, I'd become a bad one. I can't think of any other word. I wasn't bothered about authority figures or anything. One day, 4 of us decided to run away to London.
Guy and his friends were approached at Euston Station by 2 men, asking if they'd like to come to a party where there'd be free food. They agreed and were picked up by a familiar face.
And the person who came to have a look was Jimmy Savile. At first I was, scared. I just thought, that's it, I've had it now. He's going to ring police, he's going to tell me mum and dad, he's going to rip me himself. But it didn't. It worked out that he took us with him. And this is when all parties started.
Guy Marsden says the parties were attended by wealthy, middle-aged men, and his uncle Jimmy had a specific role.
Well, I know what his role was. Jimmy Savile's role was acquiring children for these top people. Jimmy Savile would then come in with children. I'd say the average age was between 6 and 9. There was one little girl, absolutely beautiful little girl. When they'd been in these bedrooms, they just come back skipping and dancing. So, I mean, how can you think that something bad's happened? He must have put word out that no happens, at least to me. So he did actually look after me that way. I told the police, I said, do you realise what's happening? They just weren't interested. Just 100% cowardice, innit? Cowardice on their part, because I told them and they didn't do out about it. My heart breaks when I think about it nowadays, but I try not to think about it actually, because it just breaks my heart. Kills me.
By 1978, Savile had committed at least 150 rapes and sexual assaults at the BBC, Duncroft School, Leeds Infirmary and elsewhere. But no one was investigating him. But one person who dared to speak out was Johnny Rotten of the Sex Pistols, icons of the punk era, who said this in a BBC Radio 1 interview in 1978.
Jimmy Savile, I think he's a hypocrite. I bet he's into all kinds of seediness that we all know about but are not allowed to talk about. I know some rumours. I bet none of this will be allowed out.
37 years later, Johnny Rotten, now known as John Lydon, spoke frankly when questioned by Piers Morgan on ITV.
So you had heard the kind of thing that we now know about him, or stuff like that?
Yeah. I think most kids did too. Most kids wanted to go to the top of the pops, but we all knew what that cigar muncher was up to. But I'm very, very bitter that the likes of Savile and the rest of them were allowed to continue.
Did you ever try and do anything about Savile?
I did my bit. I said what I had to.
Did they air that? No. It just got suppressed.
Yeah.
For legal reasons.
Yeah. And
did you meet?
I found myself being banned from BBC Radio there for quite a while for my contentious behaviour.
Because of that.
But they wouldn't state this directly. There'd be other excuses.
I mean, it's shocking.
Oh, yeah.
He got away with it for another 30-odd years.
Well, not only him, a whole bunch of them. And these are the purveyors of good taste, huh?
How did Savile get away with it for another 30 years, committing hundreds more sex crimes? One reason was growing political power, as seen in this remarkable BBC Jim'll Fix It programme.
Hello, welcome. Come in.
I must introduce all our friends.
I'm Lucy. You're Lucy.
When you were small, did you ever want to be the Prime Minister?
No, when I was small, I don't think one ever thought that there could ever be a woman Prime Minister of Britain. You know, we didn't, Jimmy, in those days, did we?
No, but we always hoped.
We always hoped, all
And
right.
you're going to fix
see,
it.
Women have come on so much during my lifetime. I still haven't quite made it to number 10 Downing Street, but I just hope that I'll do one day.
Savile openly endorsed Mrs. Thatcher.
That's fine. Yeah. Don't I get one?
Well, actually,
I thought you were going to fix my getting into number 10.
I've already done so. But I was going to see you privately about that, because I wouldn't want too many people to realise how I'd done it.
The Prime Ministerial rover, bearing now Mrs. Thatcher.
With Mrs. Thatcher in power in 1979, Jimmy Savile had a plan: to become Sir Jimmy. First, he gave Mrs. Thatcher £10,000, raised by his own fun runs, to donate to a charity of her choice. He was wooing her, and it was working, Savile's biographer later wrote. The destination was now clear: a knighthood.
You don't need me to tell you that the long drive before a long meeting is a bit of a strain. So why not do what I do? Take the train.
As his political influence and marketing power grew, Savile felt he could do whatever he liked, whenever and wherever.
I get to meetings relaxed and on time because this is the age of the train.
I got on the train at Grey Station and got on one of those carriage compartments, like the Harry Potter train, but it goes right across the train. It doesn't have the corridor. And there was a man in the carriage, and he started talking to me, and he looked at me and he said, "Do you know who I am?" And I looked. It was Jimmy Savile. He wanted to know how old I was and where I lived and stuff like that. I couldn't see any harm in talking to him about that stuff because he was Jimmy Savile, you know. And of course I was starstruck, you know, like there was Top of the Pops and he was on Radio 1 and there was Jim'll Fix It and all those things I'd grown up with. Jimmy Savile reached over and like hand on the leg, then it moved to hand on the breast. And then I realized that what I thought was his hand in his lap wasn't his hand in his lap. He'd obviously been playing with himself on the train. He went from star presenter to manipulator. It was like we were having a normal conversation and he's trying to grope me. I was numb. I was confused. I didn't fully understand what was happening. I was 17 years old. I'd never had that, any kind of touch or anything like that before. It felt later like he took a part of that virginity, that pureness, and he robbed me of that. And I think moving forward through my life, I think that's why I've had 2 failed marriages, because it never felt right. I never told my parents. I would have got the 3rd degree. I was in the wrong place. I shouldn't have been on that part of the train. It was probably my fault, because this was the early 80s. If girls got assaulted, they were drunk, they were wearing too short a skirt, they were dressed provocatively. You know, nothing much has changed really, but it was even worse back then. These pictures have been sitting in a box. I've very rarely looked at them. Before this one was taken, there were lots of photographs of me. After these, not so many. And these 2, we're in England, getting ready to leave. I just wasn't happy. Saw an advertisement, said nannies wanted in Canada. And I applied, and 6 weeks later, I was in Calgary. It was hard to leave. I was running away. I ran away. And I freely admit that. I ran away.
Back in Britain, Jimmy Savile was a superstar, admired for his tireless fundraising. Now, he wanted to secure a knighthood. He'd fund a new spinal injury centre for paraplegics at Stoke Mandeville Hospital, where he was already a volunteer. He wrote to Mrs. Thatcher, "Dear Prime Minister, all the paralysed lads called me Sir James all week. They all love you. Me too. Jimmy Savile, OBE." His target was £10 million, boosted by a government cheque for £500,000 from Mrs. Thatcher's health minister to the Jimmy Savile Stoke Mandeville Hospital Trust.
God forbid that we don't even know now who will be laid low by accident. They will be brought in here terrified. We will look after them, and we will not give them their old life back, but we'll give them a damn good new life.
I had many, many nice times in hospital. So yes, it is conflicting that I've got 2 memories of him. One where I had a good time. I went to a radio show, I went on TV. And then the other side that I don't like to remember, where he was different. When I was 17, I had appendicitis and I was taken into hospital. They kept me there for 10 days. And eventually I decided I was going to volunteer helping others at the hospital. My job was to meet and greet generally. At the weekends, people who'd fundraised at home would come along with their cheques, present them to Jimmy, and my job was just to sort of usher them in and out.
You had a what?
Jump sale.
Yes.
And we raised £25.55.
£25.55. Good heavens.
Generally, I knew him as an uncle almost. I was one of his gang, and I think I was the only girl. We'd find little places to go and sit and chat and make jokes. It made you feel as if you were doing something because you were helping to raise all this money, £10 million we were aiming for, and it felt good.
We're going to play later. Can't play just now because some of the patients are in the dinner and we'll get the sausages stuck. You'll see.
If he spoke, people listened. If he made a joke, people laughed. Everyone accepted that he would kiss you up your arm. He'd grab you, because he was Jimmy Savile and he was famous and he could do whatever he wanted and people just wouldn't say anything. So I kept some of the photos from years ago. I've got a photo being cuddled by Jimmy, and then because we were friends, he let me wear his winter coat.
That bath photo, what does it kind of represent for you?
Well, it's the day... It was the day that he raped me. I'd got a new camera and I'd taken along one of the Saturdays where we were greeting the people who come in to bring their checks.
Jimmy Savile had been given his own bedroom at Stoke Mandeville Hospital.
So we went upstairs and he said, OK, let's take this photo. So he jumped into the bath, communal bath, fully dressed, just being a silly photo. He was wearing a T-shirt and it said, sex instructor, first lesson free. So then he said, do you want a cup of tea? So I said, OK. And so we went into his room, very small single room. And the next thing I know, he's on me, kissing me, sticking his tongue in my mouth. And then it went on from there. He held me down, he raped me. And it was deathly quiet. And there was no point shouting, screaming, there was no one there. I was thinking it was my fault. I was thinking that I shouldn't have gone to his room. I shouldn't have been alone with him. He did say he's been waiting a long time for this and I wasn't getting away now. And then afterwards he said it wasn't so bad, was it? But I drove home and had a bath and I threw my underwear away. And I decided that if I told anyone, they wouldn't believe me. If I told anyone, they'd say it was my fault. I didn't tell anybody for 30 years. I didn't tell anybody until after he died. And I'd never told my parents. I thought I was the only one. So if I wasn't telling and I was the only one, then nothing was going to come out.
"60 people, the youngest, aged 8, was sexually assaulted by Savile at Stoke Mandeville Hospital.
I do believe he targeted me, and he was just biding his time. Prince of Wales and Princess Diana came to open the unit, and I went back for that. And he was there, but I didn't speak to him.
For Jimmy Savile, it was a moment of triumph. Prince Charles was supposed to come alone, but when Princess Diana turned up as well, the patients, neatly lined up in their wheelchairs, were overjoyed.
I didn't go back to the hospital after that. It felt as if I'd lost all my friends, as well as being raped.
At times, Prince Charles had to compete with the flamboyant Mr. Savile for the attention of patients.
How on earth do you raise £10 million in 3 years?
Throughout 1983, Mrs. Thatcher pressed for a knighthood for Savile. But rumours and Savile's open boasts in the press about his sex life while raising money for charity were alarming the Honours Committee. Mr. Savile, wrote the chairman, might not be able to refrain from exploiting a knighthood in a way which brought the honours system into disrepute. Savile was down, but a long way from out.
For the show business night of the year, indeed for some it's the night of a lifetime, the 1984 Royal Variety Performance. Royal Party being greeted by Lord Delfont, the man who presented this show for 20 years.
Ahead, the self-styled court jester who had already sexually abused hundreds of children.
So, up the stairs towards the royal box. The first surprise of the evening for the Queen Mother. Jimmy Savile, doorman. Suitably gold-braided, of course. Certainly makes a change from the usual shorts and sweatshirt we see him in so often. Of course, he and the royal family have met many, many times before. No tickets, he was saying, if you didn't catch that. A big smile there for Prince Charles.
Savile's campaign for a knighthood was boosted when the government appointed him in 1987 to a task force running Broadmoor, the high-security psychiatric hospital housing many of Britain's most notorious murderers, and captured here with serial killer Peter Sutcliffe.
A nice letter from the Minister himself, thanking the task force team, myself for doing it.
Savile allowed a television camera in, showing how he was fixing it for Broadmoor.
We are a great listening hospital. We listen to people. I listen to nurses. I listen to doctors. I listen to porters. I listen to drivers. I listen to everybody. We've turned into a great listening hospital.
I'm Naomi Stanley, and I did blow the whistle on Jimmy Savile many years ago, and nothing was done. I was in a new job, having qualified as a psychiatric nurse. I learned about what he was doing from patients who had arrived to the hospital I was working in from Broadmoor. What I was surprised at was the extent to which he was embedded in Broadmoor Hospital. He actually had a house in the grounds of Broadmoor that he had keys to all the wards in all the units and did move about freely. A young woman had disclosed to me what had been going on, and that he had sexual relationships with many of the young women there. And at the time, there were very young women there, 16 and I believe 15 as well. It was just accepted on that unit that young women would be used to provide sexual services to him. Staff and residents knew what was going on, and this was continuing for years. She was going to report him. She said she was going to go right to the top, and apparently, I remember this specifically, she said that Jimmy Savile laughed in her face when she said that. He commanded a lot of authority in Broadmoor Hospital and could do and act as he pleased.
He was officially referred to as Dr. Savile and allowed to watch female patients undergo strip searches and take baths.
I spoke to the charge nurse. I told him what was going on at Broadmoor, and he was just irritated, flustered. His attitude was, what are you doing, causing me these problems? I don't want to have to deal with this. I received the message to keep my mouth shut. You do not criticize anybody who's your superior. The fact that he had his own keys and could move about freely really emphasized that he really was in with the management of the hospital. It's the worst kind of collaboration.
11 people, 3 of them children, were sexually abused by Savile at Broadmoor, some repeatedly as a result of his unlimited access.
He targeted very vulnerable people because he knew it was very unlikely that somebody was going to report him to the police. It felt like an enormous injustice, quite horrific.
By now, a huge multi-institution cover-up existed over Savile's abuse. But the only uncomfortable questions he faced about Broadmoor came not from the authorities, but from teenagers on a BBC TV show.
Open to Question was a sort of Ask Me Anything format in which an audience of teenagers would grill a public figure.
Tonight, we find out as Jimmy Savile is open to question.
I was probably the naive 18-year-old thinking, well, this is going to be interesting because it's Jimmy Savile, the celebrity, but actually he's quite a controversial figure. Broadmoor, celebrity, all the stuff that he's said about his sex life. These kids sort of savage him right from the beginning.
Yes, Jimmy, governing Broadmoor is a very responsible position. Without any formal qualifications, how well suited do you think you are to this position?
I have got very formal qualifications. I've been alive for a long time. I've learned a lot of things for a long time.
Do you allow yourself to become emotionally involved with the patients at Broadmoor?
If, God forbid, your back should come against the wall of life, you will be thankful that there are people like me and my nurses about.
You seem to be a bit of an egotist. Do you think your ego has any part in your role as a charity worker and at Broadmoor?
And you could see what was unfolding in front of me. Bit of a nightmare for my first show. You know, he didn't like them, they didn't like him.
Jimmy, you have the title of a swing bachelor. How would you react? A swinging bachelor.
Have I?
So it says.
Bless me soul.
It would have been so.
Bless me soul.
How would you react as a Roman Catholic?
Yeah.
To if one of your partners became pregnant?
I mean, by this stage, the mismatch between the audience and Savile is just so enormous because he's being challenged by a young woman who's probably around the same age as the girls he would prey on. But she's challenging him about his lifestyle and his behaviour. He planted a story in a tabloid newspaper attacking the programme and attacking the BBC, saying we had turned this audience of children against him and you know, and basically having a go at us, getting his punch in first. And he could do something about it because he was well connected.
Despite the growing questions, Savile was closing in on his knighthood. His charity work had endeared him to the royal family. Prince Charles referred to Savile as his health advisor, and he'd even helped Charles and Diana through a particularly tough period of their marriage. In June 1990, aged 63, Savile's wish came true.
The TV presenter and disc jockey Jimmy Savile has received a knighthood in the Queen's birthday honours. In recognition of his charitable services, Jimmy was knighted by Her Majesty at Buckingham Palace this afternoon.
Today, though, Sir James was concentrating on the business of joining the ranks of the titled. It's an experience he clearly enjoyed.
Sir James has raised millions of pounds for charity in marathon runs and other stunts. His favourite good causes include Broadmoor and Stoke Mandeville hospitals.
And I said, my mother and father are here. And she said, are they? And I said, well, not actually here, they're in heaven. But they're here because I've got my mother's wedding ring on, and my father's wedding ring on. They're both, and she said, ah, how very lovely.
I can remember those pictures so vividly on the telly and how smug he was. And I thought, my God, he's even taken in the royal family and the Queen.
Savile's verdict? It was a ginormous relief when I got the knighthood because it got me off the hook.
Sir James Savile, OB.
Correct, yes.
Good evening.
Here? Is he here?
Yes. He is indeed.
Right.
5 years later, Savile's life story was examined on TV. His full range of evasions and distractions were on display.
What surprised me when I met him was how confident he was. He knew we'd probably be probing in areas that he would rather we didn't. We did think his behavior was very strange. We did suspect of inappropriate relations with teenagers and young girls.
Have you had lots of female
I would hope so, because being alive a long time, I would have hoped that one would have had lots and lots of them. But I've got this terrible... Oh, unfortunately, no, you see. I've got this... And anyway, I never have been a grass. And a gentleman never grasses on ladies as ever...
But we're not asking for names, we're just asking for the general principle.
I mean...
He took out the banana and started peeling the banana. That immediately moved people's attention from my questions and his lack of a response to them to the peeling of a banana on air on television.
We just want to know if you live this sort of playboy life of the DJ.
Yeah, give or take a few nights later.
And the audience chuckled and laughed, and they thought, oh, this is Jimmy Savile, what a great character. Why is that miserable, po-faced journalist asking all these unnecessary questions about our lovely Jimmy?
Have relationships and sex been casual? Is that a casual matter for you?
He mentioned the S word.
And it worked. It worked. He thought the shield around him, protecting him from proper investigation, was impregnable.
I told you I was boring.
But is it just a facade? Or the Playboy image?
Yes. Yes,
or is that answer part of the facade?
No, you can't win here.
We couldn't break it, and that it wasn't really a risk to put himself in front of somebody like me. And you know what? He proved to be right. That shield was pretty much unbreakable to his dying days.
For 40 years, Savile's crimes had remained covered up. But in the mid-1990s, two women, former Duncroft pupils, were prepared to speak out, and a newspaper was ready to publish.
I was editor of the Sunday Mirror, and the two women really wanted the truth about Jimmy Savile being exposed. Savile would take them out, sometimes together, sometimes separately, in his Rolls Royce, other times in a van of some sort. They would take into the woods. One of them said there was full intercourse. The other one told us he got her to give him oral sex. It would have been an explosive story. Jimmy Savile would have been finished.
But then the women became nervous.
They were intimidated by Savile, who'd warned them that they would ever believe them and he'd make trouble for them if they ever talked about it. One of them said, who's going to believe us, a couple of ex-approved schoolgirls, when Jimmy Savile is a friend of Princess Diana and Prince Charles, a friend of Margaret Thatcher, and had even been knighted, which was the thing that outraged her most of all. That sickened her. She kept cuttings from the year 1990, and she would stick pins in Savile's eyes on the photograph. She lost her nerve, and the other one also lost her nerve. I did alert a high-ranking police officer in the top 4 or 5 roles at Scotland Yard, and the feedback I got was that girls from troubled backgrounds like this making accusations against celebrities were in a no-win situation. So basically they didn't want to know.
In 2009, Surrey police detectives did interview Sir Jimmy Savile, now aged 82, about separate allegations by girls from Duncroft. But he would only agree to meet at his office in Stoke Mandeville Hospital.
What I've got here is really the only substantial police interview with James Wilson Savile, as it calls him here, in his entire life. And this was in 2009. All those years and all the things that he'd done that emerged later, he'd only ever really undergone one serious police interview. They put the point about the rumours, sexual relations with children, and Savile dismisses these allegations, saying, I've had 5 people make allegations that I did something because I take them to court. I sue them. They've made allegations, and not one of them wanted to finish up in court with me, so they all settled out of court. Savile sort of tries to explain away allegations against him by basically saying, people are just out to cause trouble, to blackmail me. And he says, that's why I've got this group of friends. So back referring to his old Friday morning club in Leeds, including quite a few senior policemen, and they deal with any problems. I give them my weirdo letters, pretty much telling these coppers from Surrey that he's got very influential police friends in Yorkshire, and these Surrey boys really ought to mind their own business. That's the Savile I remember, the arrogant, intimidating Savile, the litigious Savile, who, if you ever got anywhere close to him, threatened legal action or threatened his friends on high, would come down on you like a ton of bricks. That's Jimmy Savile I remember.
Sir Jimmy Savile, one of the most colourful figures in popular entertainment over the past 50 years, has died. He was 84.
He was paraded through the streets in that obnoxious casket.
I was horrified at the pomp and ceremony. It was, you know, gold coffin, streets lined with people. It was obscene.
His own charitable trust and colleagues from Stoke Mandeville Hospital, Leeds General Infirmary and Broadmoor.
This selfless Saint Jimmy, you know. That's not really who he is. He's a pervert, is what he is.
Just made me smile that he was finally dead. Weird to think how many other people must have watched that, and I thought, yeah, thank God for that.
But it would be another 12 months before the terrible secrets emerged.
Now, for the first time, we explore the other side of Jimmy Savile.
An ITV exposure documentary broadcast sensational claims from women that, as girls, they were raped and assaulted by Jimmy Savile.
She also claims Savile went on to abuse her at BBC Television Centre. Savile would invite Duncroft girls to be among the audience who used to sit on beanbags on the set of Clunk Click.
Overnight, the sainted figure had become the embodiment of evil.
At Leeds General Infirmary, they're now mounting an investigation into who knew
when
what.
One 11-year-old with cancer screamed as he assaulted her, she was told by a nurse to be quiet.
All that it takes for evil to prevail is for good people to do nothing. And that happened time again.
The Metropolitan Police found that across more than 50 years, 450 people had been sexually abused by Jimmy Savile, 328 of them children. The unmasking of Savile changed the way people viewed celebrity. From now on, fame was no bar to guilt, and a host of high-profile cases followed.
My goodness gracious.
Today, one of the law firms central to the Jimmy Savile case said more complaints have been made against Rolf Harris since the verdict yesterday.
Freddie Starr groped her when she was 14 in Savile's BBC dressing room.
This isn't the first time he's been convicted of sexual offences. The former glam rock star, known to millions as Gary Glitter.
10 years since the death of Jimmy Savile, and 17 separate inquiries costing at least £200 million. Many who knew the truth say change is needed to stop the same thing happening again.
If Broadmoor staff ever considered blowing the whistle on Jimmy Savile, they knew that they were going to have to walk out. Probably they're going to have to walk out, take their families with them, leave the house that was tied in with the job, leave the institution, that they're going to lose their social life because people will turn on them. Everybody was cliqued together. We really need to look at what happens in institutions and why people behave like this. Otherwise, it will just happen again and again and again.
It's still not a crime not to report child abuse. It's still easier for an institution to hide it, whether it's a school, whether it's a church, whether it's a national broadcaster, than to report it and make sure that the police and the authorities investigate. And I think that's a lesson we can learn from it, that we can make that change, bring in a law that says you have to report child abuse.
If it did happen again, I think that people these days would probably speak out, and they wouldn't be as timid as we were back 40 years ago.
For some, the ghost of this brazen and grotesque man remains. and will continue to haunt the nation he groomed.
I think everybody was surprised by the scale and the extent and how hidden it had remained for all these years. And I hope, too, people felt a little bit ashamed that they had elevated this man of no talent whatsoever, weird and slightly sinister, to the position of a national icon, a national treasure, whereas in fact he should have been spending most of his life in jail. I think in some ways it's a parable for the bad side, the embarrassing side of modern Britain.
I tell lies when it suits me.